Okay.
So again, I'm Joe Shaw. I'm the president of the Jack Graney chapter in Cleveland. This is a joint meeting with our Columbus Hank Gowdy chapter. And Rick and Blake, would you want to say a few welcoming words?
Hi, everybody. Go ahead, Blake.
No, you go, Rick. You're good.
No, that's great. We're just really happy that we were able to do this with Joe and the Cleveland chapter. And we've talked a little bit with Tom in preparation for this. And I think everybody's in store for a great morning. So just sit back, enjoy, and get your questions ready. I think it should be a lively discussion. But anyway, welcome on behalf of the Hank Gowdy chapter, on behalf of Blake and myself. And thanks again, Joe and Tom, for including us.
Your partners in this, my friend. Blake, anything you'd like to add?
No, just what Rick said. Thanks.
Okay. Ditto. Okay. Well, with that, again, we would like to welcome Tom Stone, author and historian, to talk not only about his book, but in particular about who are these dream teams that he has discovered, quote unquote, for the Indians, the Reds, and the Pirates. As a Yankees fan, I pleaded for Yankees today, but I didn't get it. So I went down in a blaze of glory, or a blaze of something. But I think, having said that, I think we're going to have a really exciting and an interactive time. As Tom has already said, he would love to take your questions, either going off of mute. We would ask all of you to go on mute. But if you want to ask a question, try to keep it cryptic and to the point so that we can have a lot of interaction with a lot of people. If you would prefer to send your note, as Dave Scott would call it, through the Zoom chat, Tom will be watching that as well as Blake and I, so we'll attempt to make sure that those questions also get addressed. And again, Tom, we really thank you for spending part of your Saturday morning with us, and we really look forward to a great interactive session with our two chapters. And with that, I'll turn the baton over to you.
Well, great. Thanks a lot, Joe. Thanks, Blake and Rick. It's been fun talking to you guys and preparing for this. This is the second of these that I've done. I've reached out to a lot of different SABR chapter leaders to have sessions, relevant to their local teams and about the book in general. This is the second one I've done. I did one for the Baltimore chapter recently, and that went really well. We went the whole 90 minutes, but I think people were engaged and we had a lot of fun in the chat. Had a couple of quizzes, which I'll do again today. So that'll be an interactive portion for sure. What I want to do is just introduce myself a little bit and go through on a high level about the book, and then we'll dive into the Indians first, and then the Reds, and then a little bit on the Pirates at the end. So just about me, I grew up in Rochester, New York. I still live here in the Rochester area. I went to the U of R back in 91 to 95. You can see the other information about me there, where I work and so on. I mentioned as people were joining the call that this isn't my only book. I co-wrote a book with Cassie Labori. I later married her. I always joke that if you can co-write something and edit each other's work while doing that, while you're dating, then you're probably on a solid foundation for a relationship, because editing someone else's work is definitely a challenging and humbling experience. But we got through that and got married, and now she's going on to write more books. So we have one son, Wyatt, from Cassie's first marriage, and a couple of cats. So I played baseball, of course, as a kid here in Western New York, but you can't play year-round in Rochester, certainly Cleveland and Columbus the same way. The weather doesn't allow for that in the winter. And so what do? You play simulation games as a kid in the 70s and 80s. I didn't actually play Stratomatic. I know that's probably the most popular. APBA is another old one. But I played Kodako All-Star Baseball, the disc-based game. And some of you have probably played that back in the day, or even still play it today. And then moving on, I was one of the lucky ones to have an early Atari computer, so I played Micro League. Micro League came built in with some famous teams like the Big Red Machine or 61 Yankees, and it was all simulation based, so it wasn't joystick or action based. It was an early simulation game. And I actually then got the General Manager disc, which allowed you to create your own teams. And so that's what I did. I spent time usually by myself, but sometimes with my brother or a couple of other friends, and we'd go through the old paper encyclopedias. I had lots of copies of those, well before the internet and Baseball Reference and so on. And I would create all-time dream teams, load them laboriously into my Atari, and then have these teams play against each other. So I was doing this at a pretty young age, say 10, 12, 15 years old. So it's been something that's been on my mind for a long time. You could say that I started thinking about this kind of a book project maybe when I was 10. I actually started writing the book when I was about 26 in 1999, which means that I worked on it off and on for about 20 years because it came out in January of 2019. So it took a long time. It's a 600 plus page book. Here it is. If you can see it, it's a big, thick book. Part of that is some of the things that I chose to include in it and the level of depth that I went into, which I'll get into here in just a minute. Part of it too is just when you write something and then go back and rewrite, more baseball was played. So players like Albert Pujols and Derek Jeter and Mariano Rivera and Mike Trout, they weren't really considered or even playing yet in the major leagues when I started in 1999. But as time went on, I needed to obviously include them. Had a really good editor, Gabriel Schechter. He was a researcher at the Baseball Hall of Fame for a number of years, lived in Cooperstown. Got connected with him. He was one of 2 editors I had. I had a copy editor as well. Hooked up with Active Sports as a publisher. They published the Bill James Handbook each year. Got connected through some business contacts with them, and so they're my publisher. And then I have a publicist as well. I've done about 100 radio interviews, and my publicist also got me on MLB Now, which was a sort of experience of a lifetime back in February of last year. That was a lot of fun. There's me sitting next to Joe Girardi, and then being interviewed by Scott Braun. A lot of book authors get on the MLB Now show. It's certainly not unique, but for me, that was sort of a dream come true to be a first-time baseball author and be able to get on a show like that. So sort of at a high level, what is the book? It's on all-time dream teams, certainly not the first book to tackle this subject. I did it a little bit differently. I chose full 30-man rosters. Why 30 instead of 25 or 26? Basically because I found that if I limited myself to 25 or 26, the pain of the snubs that weren't included was just too great to bear. So I gave myself a little extra room, a few extra spots on the rosters, cover all 30 franchises, obviously. I started with wins above replacement as sort of a starting point. I'll talk about some of the other considerations I use because I didn't only look at WAR, but that is something that I think my book is sort of unique compared to ones that came before WAR even existed. I included starting lineups, which we'll see against both right-handers and left-handers. So there's some interesting platoons and things like that for consideration. I include visual depth charts, which again, I'll show you the ones for the Indians and the Reds and the Pirates here as we move along. And then something my book does, and again, a reason that it's 600 pages long, is I compared my choices with all the other authors and fan surveys that I could find, going back to the 50s and even late 40s. By then, baseball had had enough history that there were other authors and fan surveys thinking about all-time dream teams. And I did a lot of research, including going to the library at the Hall of Fame and using microfiche and trying to dig these things up. And so each chapter, compares my choices with Rob Neyer's book, and there was a big book in the 80s. There was a fan survey from 1969, and so on. So a little bit about sort of the ground rules, because there's different ways to think about dream team rosters, of course. I mean a franchise. When I say the word franchise, I do mean the entire history of each franchise. So the Twins includes their time as the Senators. Nationals isn't just the last several years, but includes their time as the Expos. Dodgers, of course, both cities. Braves, all 3 cities, and so on. Orioles includes the Browns, things like that. Like I said, I chose 30 players, not just a starting lineup. So there's a lot more to debate. So 16 position players plus 2 more. So a total of 18 position players. Needed to have a good mix in the outfield, required at least 1 pure center fielder, but didn't have to have 2 each at each outfield position. I gave myself some flexibility there. If you do the math, that means there was 12 spots for pitchers. I definitely weighted towards more starting pitchers than relievers. Relief has become a specialty relatively more recently in the game. Some of the teams I only included a couple of relief pitchers, some I included up to 5. So it doesn't really look like a traditional roster in that sense, where you tend to have more relievers than starters, but that's because the history of the game, there's just so many more starters to look at. So that's the way I went with the pitchers, as you'll see. I spent a little bit of time on the managers. That's not really a specialty of mine. I chose the top 4 managers for each team. I really just looked at their wins-loss percentage, how they did in the postseason, anything else I happen to know, but I didn't research the managers a lot. So certainly if any reader thinks that one of the managers I chose really stunk, he was only good because he had great talent, and he was horrible in the clubhouse, whatever, I probably wouldn't be able to argue too much about that. And then lastly, only accomplishments for their team are considered. So someone who was maybe great as a career, but only played for a particular team for a couple of years, only those couple of years count towards that consideration. Other authors have done that differently. Some authors have had this sort of arbitrary rule that a player can only make one dream team. I didn't want to have that. So there's plenty of players that make two. Frank Robinson makes the Reds and the Orioles. Lefty Grove, right, makes the Athletics and the Red Sox. Jimmy Fox, Eddie Collins. There's lots of guys. There's actually 4 players, and this will be our first little trivia question for the chat. There's 4 players that by my selection, and again, different readers, all of you on the call might vary in terms of all the players you would choose, but there were 4 guys that made 3 of my all-time dream teams. So if you want to, as we move along here, I'll circle back to this a little later, but if you want in the chat, you can try and guess who those 4 players are. I'll give you one more hint. 3 are pitchers and 1 is a hitter. So what 4 guys, 3 pitchers and 1 hitter, made 3 all-time dream teams? So you can think about that and put some guesses in the chat if you like. And Ryan, you were on the previous call, no fair naming off all 4. So what considerations did I use? Wins above replacement, I said, is sort of where I started. That's become so prominent, not just among sabermetric circles, but with ESPN and MLB and really everyone, even casual fans have at least heard of it. You can certainly look in my book at the stat tables, which we'll see a little bit of here, and you could just see, okay, who has the highest WAR for that team at that position. And if you wanted to, you could pick a team just based on that. But I didn't end there. I looked at traditional stats that every fan is familiar with and definitely considered those, even the ones that serious Sabre folks, raise an eyebrow at or argue aren't very valuable, like wins and saves and batting average and so on. I considered everything. I looked at honors and awards. I figure if one player was an all-star 8 times and someone else only twice, that probably counts for something, even though admittedly all of these awards and honors are popularity contests. Sometimes we can all disagree with certain MVP awards and things like that. Certainly Gold Glove awards sometimes rely more on the player's past performance than their current year. So I realize all that, but I did want to consider those things. And then postseason performance. We all know some players do really great in the postseason, others choke. WAR only looks at the regular season, so I wanted to consider that. But there are some players that don't make my all-time dream teams, even though they were very crucial to a team's winning a World Series. If that's their main claim to fame and they're going up against a player who did a lot more over a much longer period of time in the regular season, it's hard to balance those 2 things. So all of this, all these criteria speak to the fact that with 30-man rosters, 30 teams, that's 900 selections in the book. Way more players are covered and talked about in the book than even those 900. No reader is going to agree with all 900 of my picks. And that's what makes a call like this a lot of fun. Talking and discussing and arguing about some of the picks. No one's going to agree with all 900. So.
This is Joe. Just to interrupt you, see, there's a quite interesting question in the chat about did MLB use your book or research methodology in building their simulated greatest teams?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So a couple of things. There's been a series recently by Axios Sports. They're a news journalism sort of newsletter company. They used my book as the groundwork for selecting theirs. They came up with ones and did it over a 30-day period. As for MLB and their dream bracket, they did not use my book. The beat writers for each team in conjunction, I think, with the PR or other people at each club came up with their own rosters. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap. There's probably 80% are the same as my picks because there's only so many positions for these things that really are debatable. So many of them are obvious choices. So no, they didn't use my book. They used Out of the Park Baseball as the simulation engine. I'm also partnered with Out of the Park Baseball, and I'm going to be doing my own project with them later this year. And so I'll say more about that at the end. I'm going to do something far more robust than what MLB did. For those not familiar, MLB chose all-time dream teams. They ran a tournament, sort of a March Madness style bracket tournament. Each round was only a 7-game series. Anything can happen in a 7-game series, of course. And so there were some very interesting results. Like the all-time Brewers in the first round beat the all-time Giants. That would only happen 1 out of every 10 or 15 times. The Giants are a loaded, stacked roster, obviously, and the Brewers with a pitching staff of Teddy Higuera, Ben Sheets, Giovanni Gallardo. There's no way that those pitchers would do well against Willie Mays, Mel Ott, Barry Bonds, Bill Terry, Willie McCovey on a regular basis. So that's just one extreme example. But the Brewers beat the Giants in their tournament. Things sort of calmed down as the tournament went on. And the end result, if you hadn't seen it, was the Yankees beating the Reds. So that was interesting. The Reds represented the National League. I think you can make a case that could happen some of the time. Obviously, the Yankees are a strong team and wouldn't always win it, but in this case, did take the championship in that tournament. It was a lot of fun to follow what MLB did, but no, they did not use my book as a starting point. I'm seeing some of the guesses here, and then we'll move on to the next slides here. So players that played for 3 of my all-time dream teams. Nolan Ryan is definitely one. So you've got that one right. Roger Clemens is another because I included him for the Blue Jays and Astros. I'll note that as I update the book in subsequent years, I think Justin Verlander is going to take Clemens' spot at this point. So Clemens will probably fall off this list. But as of now in the book as it's published, Ryan and Clemens are 2 of them. Gaylord Perry only made 2. I did not include Reggie Jackson on the Yankees. That's a debatable thing to do, obviously, given how important he was in the postseason. But they have a lot of great outfielders to choose from the Yankees, and he did not make the Angels either, and obviously not the Orioles. So he did make the Athletics, clearly. Randy Johnson only made 2 as well. He made the Mariners and the Diamondbacks. He didn't quite make some of the others that he played for. So you've got 2 out of the 4. You've got Nolan Ryan and you've got Roger Clemens. So there's one other pitcher. I'll give you an extra hint. He's a relief pitcher. So no, not Kurt Schilling. He makes 2 teams. Alex Rodriguez is the hitter. Steve, good job. A-Rod makes the Yankees, the Rangers, and obviously the Mariners. And yes, Philip, Raleigh Fingers is the relief pitcher that makes all 3. So you've gotten all that. Good job. You guys did better than the Baltimore chapter did on that one. All right. So as I said, I compared my choices in the book with other previous books. This goes back to the 40s and the 50s. Sport Magazine did a great series that covered all 16 clubs at the time. So that was sort of the first big attempt at doing all-time dream teams that I could find. There was a fan survey in 1969 that again covered all the teams. There were a bunch of other books sprinkled in between and throughout all the decades here. Acasella and Dewey had a great book that was sort of my favorite book in the 80s, and then they updated it in 1992. Rob Nyer had a great book where he really chose in-depth rosters in 2003, and then there were various others. So again, there's quite a few pages in each chapter that sort of cover this aspect, comparing with other books and fan surveys, and that's another reason that the book ends up being such a 600-page doorstop, if you will. All right, so with that, let's take a look at the Indians. You've got the depth chart here. One thing to note about this depth chart as you're looking it over is that there's more than 30 names here. And that's because, like any good depth chart, I include players at each position that they played at least a fair amount of time. So Carlos Santana and Victor Martinez are listed as both catchers and first basemen. Jim Thome is over at third and first. He's obviously the starter at first, but then he played some at third. There's a few other players, obviously some outfielders played multiple positions like Larry Doby, Earl Averill, and so on. So this is who I went with. There's some that are obvious and easy choices. There's some where particularly some of the backups that are maybe more controversial, and we're going to dive into some of those in just a moment. I wanted to compare though, you guys brought up the MLB Dream Team as part of their bracket, so I wanted to bring up some of those controversial things. MP Green is asking, is the first name the starter? Yeah, so these are in order by, first name is the starter, second's the backup. The third or fourth names at first and third, it's not necessarily based on anything. It's just, additional positions that those guys played. And the DH spot, obviously they didn't have to play DH. Larry Doby didn't play when there was a DH. Earl Averill, Hal Trosky, only Manny did. But I just sort of ranked guys that I thought weren't starters and would satisfy and be good DHs. So over here on the left are some of the differences between what MLB recently did as part of their Dream Bracket tournament and what I did. So they had Roberto Alomar instead of Bobby Avila. They had Francisco Lindor favoring the current star over Joe Sewell as the backup shortstop. They didn't include Joe Jackson at all. And it's not because they, said you can only be on one team. I mean, it'd be one thing if they had that rule and included Jackson for the White Sox instead of the Indians, but they just omitted him entirely from this roster, which I thought was kind of odd. Understandably, they included Sandy Alomar Jr. as a better defensive catcher than say Carlos Santana, who at this point you could make a case longevity-wise deserves a roster spot somewhere, but maybe not so much as a catcher. They included Travis Hafner as a sort of legit DH. Obviously, some great offensive numbers from Pronk. They included Gaylord Perry based on his sort of peak performance. Didn't play a lot of seasons for the Indians, but obviously had some outstanding ones. But because of that, they didn't include Addie Joss, Mel Harder, Wes Farrell, or Mike Garcia. Now, part of that is because they had a smaller roster size, so they couldn't include as many pitchers. But notably, they included Gaylord. And then in the bullpen, they went with more recent guys, Cody Allen, Andrew Miller, and Bob Wickman over Jose Mesa. I only included 2 relievers here. I think if I were to bulk that out, I would definitely include Allen, Miller, and Wickman if I were to have, say, 5 instead of just 2. So I don't really object to the ones that they included there over Mesa. So any initial thoughts here? We're gonna look at a couple of these positions, and I'll show you the stat tables. But any initial thoughts? Anyone want to come off mute, hear someone's voice other than mine, or just add some thoughts in the chat as well? And we'll again dive into some of these positions specifically. Yeah, MP Green.
I had a couple. Cologne is not on the list as the pitcher, and the other one is Lindor just too new?
Yeah, so for my book with Lindor, my book only goes through the regular season of 2018, so it doesn't include Lindor's last year. He's getting closer and closer. We're going to look at the stat table for shortstop. I've also heard from some Indians fans that say, what about Omar Vizquel? So you got a lot of candidates there at shortstop. A lot of people don't realize how good Joe Sewell was. I think most people agree Boudreau is the clear starter. But yeah, there's a lot of good candidates for the backup. You could also include 3 shortstops instead of what I did by including extra outfielders. So yeah, I think Lindor, if he stays with the team, I'm sure people in Cleveland are all hoping that he will. I think he'll force his way onto this roster one way or another soon. And then with Cologne, I'm sure I looked at him. We'll look at the starting pitching table and see where he ranks in terms of some of his numbers. For me, he just didn't quite measure up with some of the others here. Sabathia as well, also not quite measuring up. Anyone else with initial impressions?
Tom, this is Joe. Just a question. Using your methodology, were the second base and shortstop people pretty closely bunched, or did these 4, 2 each, clearly separate themselves from some of the others like Roberto Alomar and so forth?
Yeah, for me, Alomar doesn't measure up because he only played 3 seasons. I mean, if you want to really emphasize peak performance, then you could argue for him clearly over Avila. But if you look at total value over time, I didn't think he came close. I think shortstop's the one where it's a lot closer. You can make the case for Lindor at this point and Vizquel and maybe even some others. So yeah, okay. I think shortstop's more bunched up. Cliff Lee, I did look at Dennis Eckersley as well. But yeah, they just didn't measure up in terms of length of time with the team. Obviously, Eckersley's a Hall of Famer. Lee had a great career as well. But looking at just their time for the Indians, didn't measure up with some of the other guys that I ended up choosing. And yes, Philip, I am leaning at this point towards including Sandy Alomar instead of, say, an extra outfielder. I feel embarrassed at the defense that Victor and Santana would provide. And so having Alomar on there as a third catcher, Santana can play first and DH obviously as well. So I don't really want to take Carlos off the roster, but maybe take Elmer Flick or somebody like that off, as no need to have 8 outfielders, I think. Veda Pinson, great player. Dave just sent me a private message, but yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
Tom, you mentioned Joe Jackson was nowhere to be seen, White Sox or Indians, on the MLB. I know you can't speak for them, but do you think it had to do with the Black Sox or?
No, I don't. I think he was included on the White Sox. I meant to say he was only not on the Indians. I'd have to double check that, but I think they included him on the White Sox. So I don't think it was an issue of the Black Sox scandal. They included Pete Rose on the Reds roster as well. So they didn't exclude those guys from that tournament in the way they do throughout the Hall of Fame and other things. All right, well, I can jump back to the depth chart if people need me to at any point. But let's take a look at a couple other things with the Indians here. So their starting lineups, this was always a lot of fun for each team. Look at the batting averages and on-base percentages at the top of this order, the table setters: Speaker, Jackson, and Lajoie. I mean, that is before the big boppers like Tomei and Doby and Bell and Ramirez. I mean, imagine those three guys getting on base, stealing some bases. I mean, to have those three at the top of your order is really impressive. And then the power in the middle of the lineup, very good as well. I made a few decisions here. I platooned Doby and Ramirez as DHs. I figure one's a lefty, one's a righty. That would work well. I platooned the two shortstops. If you wanted to play Lou every day, you certainly could. But Joe Sewell is such an interesting guy statistically, and almost never struck out, had a high batting average. Martinez is a switch hitter, so obviously he would need some rest, and you'd want to get Sandy Alomar in there if you include him in the roster for defense. So really powerful lineup here. I got to say, when I was writing the book, going into each chapter, I had sort of a conception of what I thought things might look like. But I was impressed coming away with these lineups, just the abilities for the guys at the top to get on base, and then the big home run hitters that follow. I mean, they do a lot of damage, even compared to other all-time dream teams. I mean, obviously these are sort of all-star lineups, no matter what team you look at, but even compared to other dream teams, this is pretty potent stuff. So let's look at first base and second base real quick. Jim Tomei pretty clearly needs to be included. I included Hal Trotsky, and you saw that the MLB included Travis Hafner instead. So a couple things to explain about these tables. WAR is WAR. That's the wins above replacement while they played for the Indians. W3 is their top 3 WAR seasons. So you can see here, Tomei, his top 3 WAR seasons added up to 20.8, a good deal higher than Trotsky, Hafner, Thornton, or Hargrove. And then W divided by G, that's WAR per games played. So that gives you a good sense of the value over time. So I really wanted to look at WAR, not just total WAR, but also peak WAR, which I took the top 3 seasons. And then WAR divided by games played, which is a weird looking stat with that 0 out in front. But again, you can see Tomei's value per games played significantly higher than Trotsky or Hafner. But what's interesting here is just how close Trotsky and Hafner are, right? Their total WAR is close, their peak WAR is close, their WAR divided by games played is close, even their total home runs is close, 216 versus 200. Their OPS plus is almost the same on the far right, 135 to 138. So really choosing between Trotsky and Hafner, based on the numbers you see here at least, is a pretty close call. Looking at second base, this is where you get into the things about longevity versus peak performance. So if you compare Avila versus Alomar, clearly Avila played 10 years, Alomar only 3. So he has more WAR, but the WAR per games played isn't even close. Alomar is 0.0431. Avila is only 0.0231. So almost twice as much value per game, according to WAR, for Alomar versus Avila. So not even close there. But I went with Avila because of the duration, the longevity with the team. MLB went with Alomar instead based on peak performance. And then you see some of the others here. Again, Kipnis, this doesn't include his season last year, although that didn't provide too much value. One other thing I should note for anyone that might be looking things up on Baseball Reference, these WAR numbers are now 100% all inaccurate. Why? Because the WAR equation changes over time. Both Fangraphs and Baseball Reference, and I should note I use the Baseball Reference version, they change the equation over time as scholars and more researchers think about it more and try and improve upon it. I don't get into the details of any of that in my book. My book is meant to be sort of a bridge for casual fans to learn a little bit more about sabermetrics, not just WAR, but OPS plus and ERA plus and things like that. And a lot of readers have told me that my book has been helpful for them. They now understand to the point, Ryan, you made WAR, what is it good for? Well, to some degree, it's good for this. It's good for comparing players across eras and taking into consideration ballpark effects and having both an offensive and defensive component. I mean, people argue that, whether they like WAR or not, but it is one of those types of stats like TPS and win shares and others over the years that have tried to do this. So leaving the disputes about whether you love WAR or not aside, a lot of readers are getting introduced to this way of thinking about the game, and they find it helpful that way. But to go back to my point about how the equation is changing, it is, and so all of these numbers are off by a little bit, not by a lot, but enough that, say, some of the Trotsky versus Hafner numbers might be sort of flipped because some of the numbers have changed. When I update the book in a year or two, I'll obviously be needing to update all the WAR stats and every single stat table. That'll be a lot of fun. No.
Tom, there's a good question from Devin there worth taking a look at in the chat
Yeah,
box.
for multiple position players like Tomei, did you factor in overall production or just the production from the years they played at that position? No, I did overall production, and that's a really good question. So Tomei played some third, obviously DH, a lot at first. This is his total time with the Indians all in. And that really comes into play for some teams. When we get to the Reds here in a little bit, you know, Pete Rose played lots of positions. I looked at his whole time with the Reds. Not his time for the Phillies or Expos, but his whole time for the Reds. And then I had the option, frankly, of where on the roster did I want him to be a starter. I ended up using him in the outfield, and we'll get into why when we look at the Reds roster. But, you know, he played second, he played third. Didn't play first for the Reds. That came later when he was in Philadelphia. But yeah, good question. And it gave me some flexibility in terms of where to slot players. Third base was an interesting situation. If you just looked at total WAR, an old timer named Bill Bradley would have been the top choice, but I didn't even include him on the roster. It's very close here between Bradley, Keltner, Rosen, and then there's a bit of a drop off. Jose Ramirez obviously is coming on very strong, particularly if you look at his value per game played. It's higher than almost anyone on this list other than Nettles, who only played 3 years for the team. So I think Jose Ramirez, like Lindor, is probably going to force his way onto this roster very soon. And that's going to be a tough call because I like Rosen and I like Keltner. I think they both are deserving here. This is a good example, again, of where Keltner played a couple of extra years. He only has slightly more WAR. But when you look at the WAR by games played and the peak WAR, Rosen is clearly superior to Keltner. So that's why Rosen got the starting spot and Keltner is the backup. Here's shortstop. This what we've already been saying, and to Joe's question, a little bit crowded. I've got Boudreau, Sewell. You see Omar Vizquel there. Lindor, not including his good season last year. On a per game basis, Lindor is the best by far, even better than a little bit better than Boudreau and significantly better than Sewell. Way better than Vizquel. And again, WAR doesn't have a defensive component. You can argue whether it's a big enough component or not. But for what it is, that's where Vizquel comes out. I've had some Indians fans on Facebook say they really need to see Vizquel on the roster, and I respect that. But I think with Lindor coming on, it's going to be even harder to get Vizquel on there. I think Lindor will be deserving very, very soon. So there's the shortstop table. At catcher, you can see why I didn't include Alomar Jr. based on these numbers. But again, at this point, I think that's a mistake. I think perhaps his defensive component, just isn't being captured enough by WAR to raise these numbers a bit. I realize I'm injecting some subjectivity by doing that according to my own methodology. His OPS plus was well below league average at only 92. He played in a high offensive era and didn't really produce a whole lot of offense. He wasn't horrible, but 277 average, that's nothing to slouch at, but way better than Santana's average, but way less power too. So I went with Santana and Martinez, but at this point, I'm sort of regretting not having a better defensive catcher included. Question from Ryan, when you look at both Ohio teams, any big differences? He says Indians have the better pitching, I think. Absolutely, and we'll see that when we look at the Reds roster. The Reds, like the Indians, have pretty good position players, big red machine supplemented by many others, as we'll see. But the pitching, not so much, and the Indians pitching isn't too bad.
Tom, you made a comment about WAR that it does to some degree include defensive capabilities thereof. But do you feel that based upon your assessments here that maybe it undervalues, or you hinting at maybe you think it or undervalues defense, or just making an open statement?
Yeah, I've read some articles where people have made that case. I haven't looked into it in depth myself. I think it doesn't overvalue it. I think few people would argue it overvalues it. It seems to do its job and include defense appropriately for some players, like say a Bill Mazeroski or some others. that were, you know, truly not that impressive offensively. And then they have strong, but it's not clear to me. I'll admit I'm not a WAR expert. I'm someone who's coming in and using it for what it's known for and relying on it. And people can criticize me for doing that and not looking into it more in depth. I think it does a credible job of including defense, but if anything, it may underscore it some. And all I can say is subjectively, sometimes it feels like it doesn't include it enough for certain players, but that may be bias. That may be subjectivity where we thought someone was great defensively, and maybe the metrics just don't bear that out. There's a lot of other advanced defensive metrics today. And as I update the book in every 3-4 years, which I very much plan to do, because there'll be changes that are needed from new players like a Francisco Lindor, and because calls like this and interactions online and so on are going to convince me that I've made some mistakes in terms of who I've chosen, like say Alomar Jr. or others. I've had some of those debates, and I've already had my mind changed on a few things for other teams as well. I'm gonna look at some of the other advanced defensive metrics beyond just the component of WAR, and that'll probably help me with considering defense more. You know, in a more overall and grand way. I see a question from Ryan. Did park effects play a role? Thanks, David. Yeah, park effects are built into WAR like they are with OPS plus and ERA plus. So that when you're looking at the Rockies numbers, that tones down their numbers some. And also things like the 1930s with Chuck Klein and some of his numbers from the Baker Bowl and some of the other players that just had crazy numbers in the 30s offensively. All right, so this was all three outfields, so left field, center field, right field. You can see here some of the obvious choices like a Tris Speaker, like a Joe Jackson. This is why I was so surprised to see Jackson not included by MLB's roster. I mean, a 182 OPS plus over 6 years. That WAR by games played is the highest of anyone on these charts. Just a great player before he moved on to Chicago. So I thought he definitely should be included, and I had him as the starter. In right field. A lot of great center field candidates here. Speaker, Lofton, Averill, Doby, Sizemore. I mean, Grady Sizemore I don't include, and yet if you look at his numbers here, he had great power and speed. Obviously, he was a pretty boy that the ladies loved, but I mean, he was a great player for the Indians, and yet he doesn't come close to making this roster, really.
Tom Rocco has an interesting question about comparing players in different eras using WAR. You might take a quick
Yeah,
look
so
at
how was WAR affected by ERAs, say pre-1920s versus today's game of home runs and strikeouts? Yeah, so I think it does a credible job of factoring in the way the game has changed. Things like ERA, really ERA plus is what helps you the most with the low ERAs from the dead ball era. You know, if someone has a 120 ERA plus, even though the ERA looks microscopic back then, it's like, well, okay, but everyone's ERA was microscopic that season, so it's not really that good. That's very helpful. That's why, like Pedro Martinez's years of dominance, his ERA plus is off the charts, and it really emphasizes for you, that stat alone, just how good he was relative to, say, 1999, 2000, those years in which he was so dominant in the American League for the Red Sox. So I'd say for that sort of thing with ERA plus is an even better sort of leveler, if you will, than WAR is. One other thing I'll say about pitching stats, though, I did include players from the 1800s for the National League clubs that go back that far. I discounted to some degree, and we'll see this with the Reds, those players from those era because the game was so different. I mean, up until a certain point, they pitched underhand. And there's just so many differences, right? They changed the rules much more frequently as well. And in particular, I discounted some of the stats for the starting pitchers because they had 3-man rotations, sometimes even 2-man rotations for part of the year. A lot of the pitchers would have 300, 400, even 500 innings in a season. So when you look at the WAR for those years, it's like someone would have a 16 WAR for 1 year. Well, that's because he pitched over 500 innings. So yeah, you're going to accumulate a lot of value just by pitching a lot. So I had to take that into serious consideration. And it's not that I didn't include any pitchers. The really good ones like Kid Nichols and Cy Young, you know, they get included. But the pitchers from the 1880s that just pitched a lot of innings and didn't necessarily, weren't necessarily that great. And particularly if they only pitched 2 or 3 years, I sort of discount their WAR numbers to some extent. So here's the long list of starting pitchers. You can see Bartolo Colon, third from the bottom to the question earlier, and CC Sabathia towards the bottom, just above Louis Tiant and Charles Nagy. So a lot of pitchers were considered here. You see Gaylord Perry there, sort of 2/3 the way down. He only had 4 years, but his WAR 29.3, most of that came from 3 outstanding seasons, 27.3. So his peak WAR for the Indians, 27.3, is second only to Bob Feller. So that's how good his 3 years for the Indians were, according to WAR at least. Only Bob Feller had a stronger peak. So Perry was better than even Kovaleski. He was better than Wes Farrell. Some of the other great names here. 2.71 ERA, that's a 1.34 ERA plus for Perry. Really, really strong. Yeah, even better than Feller's for his career at least. But I didn't feel that 4 seasons was quite enough. Obviously, if you compare him with Mike Garcia right above, I included Garcia instead. You could make a case for Perry over Garcia based on that peak performance, right? His 3 peak seasons are almost twice the WAR of Garcia's peak 3. But then again, Garcia pitched a lot longer, had a very good wins-loss percentage, 142 wins and 96 losses, had a solid 1.18 ERA plus, 3.24 ERA. So that's a great case of longevity versus peak performance. Just like with Avila and Alomar at second base, you know, if you prefer the peak performance, then you would make that change. Any other thoughts here on the pitchers? You see Colon, Sabathia, some of the newer guys like that. Even knuckleballer Candiotti's on the list there at the bottom. All right, so a couple of other things that I did for the Indians and that I did for every team in the book was just look at the best single seasons. This is at the end of each chapter. It's just kind of a toss-in. These are the seasons for the hitters that have an 8 or higher single WAR for that year. So you see certain players dominate this list, those 3 leadoff hitters, Speaker, Lajoie, Jackson. Those guys obviously put up great numbers for the Indians. But the all-time best was Lou, 1948, 10.4 WAR. He batted .355, 165 OPS plus, a great season. That's the best position player WAR season when I was writing this book for the Indians. You see one name that's a little out of place, Terry Turner, 1906. Batted .291, only had 2 home runs during the dead ball era. Not very impressive line, but given the low offense of the era, and I think a pretty strong defensive component to his WAR, he ends up on this list. And then for the pitchers, there's even more players. Again, with 8 or higher, that was my cutoff. You see Corey Kluber make the list towards the bottom with his 2017 campaign when he went 18-4. Had an outstanding ERA that year relative to all the offense, 2.25. You see Feller make the list several times near the top. You see Gaylord Perry, 2 of his 3 big seasons make the list, including with the number 1 by far with 11.2 WAR. Pitched 340 innings. It helps, again, to accumulate more value if you pitch a lot of innings. I agree, Ryan. Yeah, Lou's 1948 MVP, well deserved that year, and shows up in that WAR chart for sure. And yeah, Rocco, you're right. As I said, the more innings you pitch, the better chance you'll have a high WAR. So you got to take that in consideration when you're comparing the modern pitchers with pitch limits and so on, and training staffs that limit things with the older pitchers, not just with the 1800s where it's extreme, but even with, say, Bob Feller's era where he's pitching well over 300 innings with some regularity. And you're right, Ryan. You know, we all know Feller missed some great years. Like Ted Williams, he missed some good years because of World War II. So I've always wondered what both of those guys, what their career stats would have looked like. I'm sure people have done that analysis and tried to extrapolate it out. All right, so anything else on the Indians before we shift over to the Reds? Okay. Well, let's take a look at the Reds, and it'd be fun to sort of compare them mentally back to what we just saw with the Indians. So here's the roster. Again, some players appear in multiple spots. Tony Perez is both at third and first. Pete Rose shows up in 5 different positions, actually. I ended up using him as the starting right fielder because the candidates there, as we'll see, were a bit weaker than we had at second, third, center, and left. But Rose played all over the place. I'd say definitely stronger catchers here than for the Indians with Bench and Lombardi, clearly. But to the point made in the chat, the starting pitching, not nearly as strong as Feller, Kovaleski, and company. The guys here, a lot of them are old timers. You've got Jose Rijo, but not many others. Some might say, what about Tom Seaver? Obviously, his best years were for the Mets. He did have a few good years for the Reds, but I looked at him, but I didn't end up including him. In part, though, because I included many more relief pitchers. You see here, Chapman, Franco, Dibble. I included Bourbon and Carroll. I didn't include Charlton and Myers. Could have had more of the nasty boys here besides just Dibble, but I wanted to get those 70s guys, Bourbon and Carroll, in there as well. Definitely a strong point for the Reds. In addition to their strong batting lineup is their bullpen. Definitely stronger than Cleveland. Yeah, that's right. So some of the things where there was difference between my picks and what MLB recently did, they had Rose as the starter at third base, which meant Tony Perez was relegated to the bench. I didn't want to do that. I wanted Tony to be in the starting lineup, but you certainly could make a case and have Rose at third. Their outfield starters were Foster in left, Davis in center, and Frank Robinson in right. You could certainly make a case for that, particularly if Rose is out of the picture. Center field is sort of crowded, Pinson, Roush, and Davis. A lot of good center fielders there to choose from. You can make a case for Eric Davis. They included Adam Dunn and Jay Bruce as sort of 2 low batting average, high home run, high strikeout kind of guys on the roster instead of Roush and Griffey Sr. I didn't want to do that, as we'll see. The WAR does not treat people with low on-base percentage, even if they have high home runs and higher RBIs. WAR, whether you like this about WAR or not, it does not treat those players kindly. Dunn and Bruce don't do so well with WAR. The starting pitching was very different. I think to some extent, the people that chose the MLB rosters were favoring more modern players that fans could recognize the names of. I don't want to say that they did that exclusively, but they definitely did here with the Reds. They went with Tom Seaver, Mario Soto, Don Gullett, Johnny Cueto, all good pitchers, but they chose those over the older guys that I had. You could make a case for all of them. Soto certainly, I think, was underappreciated as a pitcher. Cueto is very off and on as a hurler, but I ended up going with more of the old timers. And then in the bullpen, they went with the trio of nasty boys instead of including the 70s guys, which I seriously considered doing as well. And you could certainly make a case for that. So any thoughts on the overall roster here off the top of your heads before we look at a couple of the position charts? Especially from the Reds fans on the call.
What about Griffey Jr.?
Yeah, Griffey Jr., I mean, I think on a per game basis, he was productive at least some of the years. He just got injured so much and was such a letdown. I did look at him. I think he's in my center field table, but I just felt like to include him over, say, I probably would have included him over Dunn or Bruce, frankly, but I didn't think he should be in over his dad or over Ed.
Another one was Dave Parker. He didn't play long enough, maybe?
Not long enough. He makes the all-time Pirates, although not as a starter, because like a lot of teams, they've got a loaded outfield there for the Pirates. But yeah, he had a couple of big seasons for the Reds, no doubt about it. Sort of revived his career after he was on the downward path with Pittsburgh when he was leaving, which was great to see. I was a Parker fan, and I was glad to see him revive his career, but just didn't play for the Reds quite long enough. Okay, yeah, Rocco, you're absolutely right. This list shows the dominance of the 70s and 80s to the Reds. I mean, you've got some newer guys like Votto, in Larkin. You've got some old timers like Bid McPhee, who eventually made the Hall of Fame. I was glad to see that when it happened. But yeah, you've got the 60s with Robinson and Pinson and Maloney, but then the dominance of the 70s and early 80s is pretty stark here, as we would expect with the Big Red Machine. So in terms of the lineup, I had fun with this. I actually led off with Pete Rose and then either Joe Morgan or Barry Larkin batting second. You know, it's hard to see Joe Morgan batting seventh in any lineup, but against lefties, I figured I would drop him down and move Barry Larkin up. You could have Morgan lead off with his speed and high on base percentage. You know, Pete didn't have any speed, but I figure as a switch hitter, it helps to have help Pete leading off. Joey Votto batting third against righties makes a lot of sense. He's a great hitter against lefties as well, but I have checked the splits and he doesn't hit lefties quite as well. I dropped him to last, which is bizarre to see Joey Votto batting last. I mean, maybe last year. He didn't play so well last year, but most seasons that'd be crazy. But again, these are all-time dream teams with all-stars at every position. I thought maybe his on-base percentage even against lefties would be nice to see as the wraparound in the ninth slot. Great power in the middle of the lineup. I've got Klaczewski and Foster sort of platooning as the DH. That's pretty strong. Frank Robinson, you could hit anywhere, 3, 4, 5. Guys like Bench and Perez obviously add extra power. So again, like the Indians, a really strong lineup. And I think this is the main reason that the Reds went all the way to the World Series, only losing to the Yankees in that bracket tournament that MLB just ran. Great lineup here. So let me pause here too, because I believe this is the first screen where I've got 5 of my silhouettes. And in this case, they're all Reds players. So can we guess who the 5 silhouettes are here? From say left to right. Anyone want to come off mute and try and guess all 5 in order?
I'll give it a try.
Okay, Philip, go for it.
Well, I think it is Tony Perez first, Morgan, Bench, Rose, and Votto.
You've got the last 3, Bench, Rose, and Votto, but those first 2 are not Perez and Morgan. At least not in that order. Morgan is the first one. He's hitting.
Okay.
And so the second guy, Barry Larkin, that's right. There's a lot of photos out there of Larkin turning double plays, so I grabbed one. These silhouettes are a feature of my book. They not these 5. I only have the Johnny Bench one. What I did is I chose one franchise player for each team, sort of the player that I thought was the best overall, represented their history. For the Indians, it was Bob Feller. It could have been others. It's not a clear-cut choice. For the Reds, I went with Johnny Bench. Again, it could have been others, Pete Rose or Joe Morgan or others, but I went with Bench. And so the silhouette appears on the first page of the chapter, and then at the end of the chapter, I describe why that player was chosen as the franchise player, describe other options, just a quick paragraph. For some teams, choosing the franchise player was easy and obvious, right? George Brett for the Royals, Tony Gwynn for the Padres. Tom Seaver for the Mets is a pretty clear one. He was even nicknamed the franchise. Even Babe Ruth for the Yankees. Given all the great Yankee players, I think you'd have to pretty much go with Ruth. Some people might argue Mantle or others, but for some teams like the Reds with Bench, or say the Dodgers, think about the Dodgers. That's probably the toughest. I went with Jackie Robinson, and not because of anything political or because of breaking the color line, just based on the numbers and his WAR and everything. But you could also make a case for Sandy Koufax, Clayton Kershaw, Duke Snyder, Pee Wee Reese, Roy Campanella. I mean, a lot of great Dodger players, all pretty similar in terms of some of their numbers. So some of the chapters, it was super easy. Some of them not so much. So here's some of the franchise sort of position tables for pitchers for the Reds. A long list, even longer than the Indians. And again, each and every one of these players I describe briefly in the book. So even the ones I don't choose, which is the majority here, I at least give a couple sentences about them just to highlight some of the positives about their resume. You can see here why I didn't choose people like Cueto and Seaver and Gullett. They're pretty down on this list. And even their peak WAR, 15.6, 15.1, Gullett only 9.5, very low. I mean, Gullett had a great wins-loss record. He had a good ERA for his time, but not that impressive, 1.14 ERA plus. Obviously, guys like Gullett and his compadres and that staff benefited from the Big Red Machine, offense in terms of their winning. Guys like Seaver and Cueto, I just didn't think quite measured up their time for the Reds. I think you can make a stronger case for Mario Soto. So when I saw MLB chose Soto, I was like, okay, I can get on board with Soto a little bit more than some of the others. Jose Rijo, I think, is definitely deserving. He's much, much higher on the list. He played a bit longer, 10 seasons, lots of strikeouts. That's not in this table. But his ERA of 2.83, strong wins-loss percentage, if we still care about wins. His peak WAR is good. His ERA plus is, just looking at it, it's the highest on this whole chart. So, you know, he's sort of an unheralded pitcher outside of Cincinnati that I think deserves more recognition.
I seem to remember that Noodles Hahn had a season where he won 20 games but lost more than 20. Is that true?
That sounds right to me. I think maybe that happened to Phil Niekro once or somebody more recently as well, or came close to it. But I think that's right about Noodles Hahn. I love the fact that a player nicknamed Noodles, or sort of went by Noodles, made it into the book and actually is on one of these all-time dream teams. He's a player that I didn't know much about. I'd heard the name as a kid, but it wasn't until writing this book that I delved into it a bit further, and I was glad I could include him. Bucky Walters was an interesting player too. He started off as a third baseman, right, and then switched to being a pitcher, and as a result, he was a pretty good hitting pitcher, like a Wes Farrell, like some others that still hit today. Walters put up some pretty good hitting numbers in addition to being a pitcher. There's some guys here that are really old timers that, again, I discounted some of their numbers, like Will White. And a few others, Tony Mullane. Mullane at least pitched 8 years, and so I seriously considered including him. I don't believe I did in the end, but for somebody from the 1800s, you'd really have to have a really good ERA plus and like maybe lead the league in strikeouts or lead the league in something that was deemed important back then. Probably multiple times, and then I would consider including you. I really discounted the 1800s. Kid Nichols makes the all-time Braves, and Cy Young makes the all-time Red Sox and things like that, but there's not too many of those old-timers. So a couple of other position tables, and then we'll take a real quick look at the Pirates here in the 30 minutes that we have left. So at first base, there's a lot of great players here. I was able to include the top 4. I included Votto, Kluszewski, and McCormick at first base. I thought Frank was deserving. Tony Perez makes it, of course, as the starting third baseman. And if you look at the second table here, you see why I shifted Perez over. Not a lot of great third base candidates. I mean, some names we all recognize, like Chris Szabo and Todd Frazier and others, but not too many other really strong candidates. So I went with Groh as the backup to Perez. MLB got around this by having Pete Rose listed as a third baseman, but I wanted to use Rose in the outfield so that I could include more players here. Shows you just how good Joey Votto, other than last season, has been. If you look at his peak WAR, it's better than Perez, Kluszewski, or McCormick. And if you look at his WAR by games played, it's significantly better than any of the other first basemen on this list. If we look at, again, the top single seasons for the Reds, Joe Morgan dominates the list. His combination of offense, speed, defense, just really everything. Great player, we all know that, back-to-back MVPs and so on. But he really had lots of great seasons for the Reds. And then not surprising to see the other names here, Robinson, Bench, Foster, Rose, at least making it once each. And then Cy Seymour had an insanely good year in 1905. As some of you probably know, 377 average. He also did a little pitching at the major league level as well, if I remember correctly. But he had a great year in 1905. Oh, and it looks like Ryan has looked it up. Noodles went, looks like he went 22 and 19 in 1901. So didn't quite win 20 and lose 20 in 1 year, but came close. In terms of the best starting pitching seasons for the Reds, not too many over 8, far less than the Indians had. No pitcher here is listed more than once. I included Ted Breitenstein, 1897, 300 innings. I didn't include anyone prior to 1894, as that note at the bottom says, because again, the innings pitched just makes the numbers kind of silly when they're pitching 400, 500 innings in a year. Again, showing the strength of Jose Rijo with 10.2 WAR. in 1993. I think I've got the Pirates here. Let's take a quick look at them, and then we're going to have fun with a final bit of trivia. So here's the Pirates roster for the subset of folks on the call that are big Pirates fans, and even if you're not a Pirates fan, it's sort of fun. A lot of readers of the book say that they buy the book, they read their favorite team chapter right away. Maybe they read their team that they hate, like if they're a Yankees fan, they'll read the Red Sox chapter right away as well. And then they put it down and they pick it back up and they read maybe a chapter a week. It's sort of good as a coffee table book in that way. Do a deep dive on a team each week. So Pirates, a couple of things to note. Willie Stargell could have been left field or first base, but if you look at left field, there's a lot of great candidates. Barry Bonds, Ralph Kiner, Fred Clark. Max Carey's only listed there secondarily. He was mainly a center fielder. So I moved Stargell over to first, and it's a good thing I did because they were historically weak at first base. I mean, they have Josh Bell now. They had Jason Thompson in the 80s, and Pedro Alvarez had some home runs, and Dick Stewart, and you can name off guys, but none of them had great careers for the Pirates, really. So I had to go way back to Jake Beckley, a Hall of Famer who split his time, I think, with the Reds, actually, or somebody. I included him as the backup, but really weak at first base, so had to list Stargell there. Second base, also not particularly strong. Mazeroski is a Hall of Famer with his defense, but the backup spot was a close call between Claude Ritchie and George Grantham and Johnny Ray. I mean, just not household names by any stretch. Compare that to shortstop, where they have two of arguably the best 10 shortstops of all time, Honus Wagner and Archie Vaughn. So very strong at shortstop compared to, say, second and first. Pie Traynor at third, Hall of Famer, maybe considered a little overrated, but a great player. Tommy Leach is underrated. He played both third and center field for the Pirates during the dead ball era. So that was a player I didn't know much about before writing the book, but I was glad to learn more about him and his accomplishments. I mentioned Dave Parker earlier, definitely deserving of making this roster, but as you can see, he's only the third right fielder because you've got Roberto Clemente and Paul Wainer, two clear-cut Hall of Famers in his way. Pretty loaded outfield overall. Bonds, Kiner, Clark, Carey, and McCutcheon in center, Clemente, Wainer, and Parker in right. Not very strong at catcher, sort of like the Indians. I went with Kendall and Pena. You can make a case for Manny Sanguillen. A lot of fans have reached out, and he was such a fan favorite. Of course, Pena was sort of a fan favorite. Some people have argued I should have Pena and Sanguillen and not include Kendall. I think Kendall's offense and even his ability to steal bases was deserving of recognition. Not a lot of great relief pitchers for the Pirates. I included Face and DeCulve as the only two. You could make a case for Justy or Melanson or a few others. I included a lot of the old timers as starting pitchers. I looked at Bob Veal and some other, 60s, 70s, 80s guys, Doug Drabeck, a few others, but Candelaria was the only one that I included from sort of our modern era. Again, comparing with what MLB did recently, they had Sanguillen instead of Pena, so they had Kendall first and then Sanguillen. They listed Paul Wainer in left field, even though I had to double check this. He only played there 9 times in his whole career for the Pirates, so I thought that was cheating a little bit in order to get Wainer in the lineup. They had Bonds as the DH, so they had an outfield of Wainer, Carey, and Clemente with Bonds as the DH. They still had Kiner and Clark and McCutcheon and Parker on the roster, but they sort of cheated a little, I thought, by having Wainer in left. And then they did include Melanson and Justy as additional relievers to Face and to Covey. So Pirates fans on the call, Blake and others, what do you think here?
I think my first observation was having Ralph Kiner as not starting, and I probably over factor in because he had zero protection, and yet he had that, 7 or 8 consecutive years of leading the league that I would have put him over Bonds. I mean, Bonds always had Bonilla and Van Slyke next to him.
Yeah.
My other overall observation, not just how it impacts Van Slyke, but just how I don't feel like WAR rewards defense enough. Yeah. And maybe because I watch Van Slyke all the time, that Van Slyke would have made my team just because defensively, I mean, he was one of the best in his era. And during an era when the Pirates were really good back there in the 90s with those 3 teams, even though they never made it to the World Series. Yeah. My last observation, and I'll let somebody else talk, was just the lineup overall, I think, is an incredible lineup. But when you look at that pitching staff, it's like throughout the Pirate history, we just don't have those big marquee names, or even the guys that maybe will turn out to be a marquee name, like Garrett Cole. Of course, the economics of that team and the management of that team never holds on to those guys. I feel like the pitching staff is kind of underwhelming when you look at the rest of that lineup. I keep saying
I agree.
And one final thing is, I kind of went through your book and noticed that Archie Vaughn on probably at least a third to a half the other teams, he probably would have been a starting shortstop on a lot of teams. Just he happens to be behind one of the icons of the game with Honus. So I'll shut up. But anyway.
No, absolutely. I agree with that with Vaughn. There's a few other teams that are like that. Like the Braves at third base have both Eddie Matthews and Chipper Jones. It's like a toss-up for who you should have. Whoever you don't have would clearly be a starter on most other teams. So, yeah, there's a few spots like that. And then there's the spots that are really weak, like first base other than Stargell for the Pirates, really weak. And I agree with you on the pitching side. There's some interesting names here, and some of the old-timers had some good stats, but they're not the sort of top-shelf guys you'd expect from all-time Dream Team. I agree with you about Van Slyke. I was a big fan of his when he played. I'm looking at the table here in my book because I don't have it on a slide. He is the third one that I would have chosen behind Carey and McCutcheon. You had other good candidates too, though. Al Oliver for the Pirates was a center fielder, Ginger Beaumont, and Lloyd Wainer, who I think doesn't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, unlike his brother Paul. But he did play 17 years for the Pirates and batted .319. So they're stacked with center field candidates. And I agree. If I were to expand the roster out or maybe in place of even some of the others, Van Slyke's a good choice.
And I did notice that you did have Al Oliver on the Texas Rangers. And, I think if Oliver had spent his whole career in Pittsburgh, we'd probably see the name up here. But he had some awesome years in Texas.
Let me just bring up the lineup. Any other Pirates fans have comments on the Pirates? You'll see here I did get Kiner into the lineup here in left field in a sort of platoon with Bonds. So to your point, Blake, I'm with you. It's when you look at 7 times leading the league in home runs, it's hard to not have him in the lineup. You could use him as a DH as well. I ended up platooning Paul Wainer and McCutcheon there. The 3 silhouettes on the right, by the way, are Honus Wagner, who I obviously chose as the franchise player for the Pirates, and then Roberto Clemente, and then Willie Stargell at the bottom. All right, well, let me back up. We just have 20 minutes left, and we can use that time mostly to have a little fun here. Those of you that were at the SABR convention may have seen this. I had some printed worksheets of this. This is all 30 franchise players from my book. So there's 1 from each team. Again, Ryan, you've already seen this, so no fair guessing all 30 and ruining the fun for everyone. But there's 1 from each team. So to give you a sense of how this works, the very bottom left, that's Babe Ruth representing the Yankees. So that means Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle, Derek Jeter, none of those guys are on this 30, right? Because they all lifetime Yankees. They can't be here because Ruth is representing the Yankees. So let's have people come off mute. It might get a little noisy, but let's take some guesses on, why don't we start with just the first row, just to keep this sane. Guesses on players you see in the first row.
The bottom first row or the top?
The top, sorry, top first row.
That Williams,
You got Williams on the far right.
and then
correct.
Musial.
Musial is the second one from on the
On
left.
the left, that's right.
Griffey Jr. in the upper left, first line.
No, that's not him. You mean diving to make a catch? Nope.
No, on far left, the upper left-hand corner, the first one in the first row.
Oh, no, that could have been him with a swing, but no, that's not Griffey.
Okay.
Is Tom Seaver the third one in?
That's right. He's for the Mets. So you've got Cardinals, Mets, Red Sox.
Is McGuire on the far left?
No, McGuire's career is split, between Cardinals and A's, so he's not a franchise player for anyone.
Randy
Henderson in the middle, top row.
Yep. Yeah, Ricky Henderson running for sure.
Yeah, Randy Johnson.
Randy Johnson, the long-legged one, fourth from the right for the, in this case, for the Diamondbacks.
Is that Ted Williams on the far right?
Yeah, somebody mentioned that earlier, Ted Williams, yep.
The guy in the middle before Randy Johnson, Tony Gwynn.
Yep, he was the easy choice for the Padres. So that leaves the far left hitter, the fourth one from the left, who's the outfielder jumping, and then the two next to Ted Williams on the far right. Any guesses?
Is the outfielder Junior Griffey?
No. Good guess, though.
Is the one next to Ted Willie Mays?
No, same era, though.
Hank Aaron.
Hank Aaron for the Braves, that's right. All right, I'm going to give you those three that are remaining, then we'll go to the middle row. So the far left is a really tough one. It's a new expansion era team, Todd Helton representing the Rockies. That one's tough. The fourth one, the outfielder jumping, Mike Trout for the Angels. And then from the far right, the third one in who's batting, that's Pudge Rodriguez representing the Rangers. So those three are definitely, I think, the three toughest visually. Let's go to the middle row.
Third from the right has to be Ty Cobb.
Ty Cobb representing the Tigers, absolutely.
Fifth from the left looks like Walter Johnson.
Yep, another old-timer, Walter Johnson for the Twins/Senators.
Willie Mays in the last one, or the one on the right.
Yep, for the Giants, Willie Mays, yep. Anyone else for the middle row? How about Thunder Thighs there on the far left? He wasn't an obvious choice for his club, but I went with him. Frank Thomas for the White Sox.
Oh.
Okay. Fourth from the left, the catcher is Ed Bench.
No, that's not Bench, although it could have been.
Bench is right below
Pudge. No.
Pudge was in the top row. He was the third from the right in the top row.
That's
Bench
right.
is down in the bottom row squatting. That's another catcher in the second one. That's Gary Carter representing the Expos/Nationals.
Is the one right to the left of him, is that Schmidt?
Yeah, good. You picked out his swing. Mike Schmidt for the Phillies. So we've got a couple of sweet swings in the middle between Johnson and Cobb.
Ken Griffey Jr.
Yeah, Ken Griffey Jr. for the Mariners. And then between Griffey and Cobb.
Brett.
George Brett.
George Brett. Yeah, another sweet swinger. That's right. So that just leaves the two near the edges. So on the far left between Thomas and Schmidt, that one's almost impossible to guess. That's Evan Longoria for the Rays.
Wow.
Guesses that. And then on the far right between Cobb and Mays, that's Jackie Robinson from the Dodgers with his long stride.
Yeah, I see it.
You can see it afterward. All right, the bottom row, I already gave you Babe Ruth on the far left, and we've already got Johnny Bench as the fourth one from the left. What about some others?
Where's Bob Feller?
Marischal pitching?
No, that's Bob Feller for the Indians with the high leg kick. It could have been Marischal, could have been Spahn with the high leg kick, but it's Feller.
Not a needs a lefty for Spahn.
Well, true, yeah.
Robin Yount, second one from the right. On the end.
Yount is a shortstop, not later as a center fielder.
Cap Anson next to Bench.
Very good. A lot of people would have chosen Banks for the Cubs, but I went with Cap Anson, and that's him sort of old style with his legs crossed.
And I only got that because I remember seeing in the book that you had picked him as a franchise player.
Yeah,
other than that, I'd stand no chance of getting that.
Yeah, sure.
Ichiro next to Cap Anson?
No, and that's because Griffey Jr. wins it for the Mariners, not Ichiro. He's not on here. The one on the far right is the only easy one left.
Honus?
Yeah, we just saw that on the previous slide, Honus Wagner for the Pirates. The other ones are mostly expansion era teams. The third from the left is not an expansion era team. Shortstop.
A-Rod?
No, not A-Rod. He made 3 teams, but didn't do enough with any one club to be a franchise player.
Cal Ripken.
Cal Ripken?
Cal Ripken for the Orioles. That's right. When you think franchise player, that usually helps with us. And then we've got 3 on the sort of right-hand side. So in the middle next to Cap Anson, we've got a guy with a leg kick. We've got a pitcher that's very deceiving as to who that might be. And then we've got a power hitter third from the right. And they're all expansion era clubs.
The pitcher's Nolan Ryan.
Nolan.
isn't it?
Yeah.
It really looks like Nolan, but again, he played for 3 different teams, so he wouldn't be the franchise player for any one of them. That one's tough. I consider that almost as tough as Longoria. It's Dave Stieb for the Blue Jays.
Wow.
You could choose other. You could choose Bautista. You could choose other guys for the Blue Jays. I went with Stieb, so that one's a tough one.
I saw his no-hitter against the Indians in Labor Day 1990 or 91.
Yeah, he was one of the best pitchers of the 80s, but between Anson and Stieb with the leg kick, I went with Biggio for the Astros in a close call over Bagwell. So, you could argue either way there. And then the power hitter there to the third from the right still plays in Major League Baseball, but not for the team that he's the franchise player for.
Someone on the Marlins.
Stanton. Yep, Giancarlo Stanton. So there it is. As you've seen, I've made a lot. I made these myself. I went out and just got common images, sort of iconic images, and then I sit in Photoshop when I'm bored in a business meeting and sit there and create these silhouettes. It takes me about 20 minutes each. I've created obviously many more than the 30 that were in the book. At this point, I've created a bunch for a lot of different teams. If you're familiar with print-on-demand things, I'm actually creating products with some of these silhouettes. So here's I've got 7 players from the Orioles, and I've made a face mask. I'm going to put it on coffee mugs and T-shirts and things. And you don't make a lot of money from these companies like Cafe Press or Zazzle, but you can make a little bit of extra money. And so I figure this is my little silhouette art. I'm putting it out there on these things. And the face masks, by the way, are nice. I've actually got one here. Can anyone tell who these 5 old players are? If I get up close to the camera.
Ruth.
Brooks Robinson.
No. What is special? These 5 players have something in common.
They're all Hall of Famers.
All Hall of Famers.
The original 5. The original 5.
They're the first class. I wanted to have a first class face mask, so that's my first class face mask. Yeah, they were the first 5. Christy Mathewson, Walter Johnson, Ty Cobb, Honus Wagner, and Babe Ruth. So yeah, this is something I haven't really started putting out there yet, but I'm going to be creating a bunch of different products with not just the silhouettes from the book, but others as well. And the other thing I just wanted to mention as we come to a close here is I mentioned earlier Out of the Park Baseball. They're the simulation company. They're in their 21st version of their game. They've been around a long time, very robust game. They're the ones that partner with MLB. They do the predictions for the season with MLB at the beginning of each year. They're the engine behind that. And then they did both the bracket we talked about with the all-time dream teams. They also did another tournament recently with all-time single season teams. So like the Big Red Machine against the 61 Yankees and things like that. And that was another fun one they did. So I'm going to be working with them, and I'm going to run 100 full seasons of the dream teams from my book. I'm going to supplement each one with a few additional relievers, but it'll be basically what you see from my book. Because while the MLB bracket was fun, like I said, the Brewers beat the Giants, and that is craziness. So I want to see over a full season, and not just one full season, but I want to do 100 full seasons. How many out of 100 seasons would the Yankees win? How many would other teams win in terms of the championship? How would specific players do? It all comes down to the ratings and the numbers in the simulation. So you can tweak things, and all of a sudden one player would do way better than he should. But if you get it as close to quote unquote right as you can, I think we'll do the best we can. and we'll see what teams do really well. I think that the Yankees will do well with their lineup and with Rivera and the bullpen and so on. Their pitching, though, is Whitey Ford, Lefty Gomez, Ron Guidry, Andy Pettit. It's good, but it's not as good as the Braves. It's not as good as the Giants, the Red Sox. There's lots of teams with better starting pitching, the Dodgers. And some of these other teams, as we saw today, the Reds, the Indians, certainly the Giants and Red Sox, they've got powerful lineups too. So it's hard to predict, would the Yankees win 25 out of the 100 championships? That's possible. Possibly they'll win more than any other. But it's going to be interesting to see, what happens when I do this full in-depth simulation. So with that, thank you. This was a lot of fun for me. I love talking about this, obviously. It sounds like you guys do too. I hope we all had a good time. I guess I'll just turn it back over to Joe. If there's any other questions that I missed in the chat or anyone wants to come off mute, happy to take on more questions.
Yeah, I'll just lead off by just thanking you again for doing it. We appreciate the preparation for, particularly the three teams that we're probably most interested in, but especially the Indians and the Reds is probably the biggest group, and we really appreciate that. It was insightful and just fun way to spend a Saturday morning. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. I love it too.
And I'll second that, Tom. That's a terrific presentation. I look forward to some of your work in the future. It's going to be great.
Yeah, I'm going to be updating
Tom,
the book.
this is
I was
Joe.
going to, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, they've captured it very well. I only had one little thing. You set a new high water mark for us. 30 people requested the information. 30 people showed up today.
Oh, nice. Well, I appreciate that. Hopefully provide a good value for everyone on this Saturday morning.
It was a great hour and a half together.
Yeah, good. So yeah, the book's available for those that don't already have it. I am going to update it, but I'm not updating it this year, given that we're only going to have this sort of weird 60-game season, if we're lucky. I'm going to wait and update it again at the end of the 2021 season. So if you want to wait that long and get the second edition, you can. Otherwise, you can get it, get the current edition now.
Tom, I had a question about the updates. Are you gonna do a whole new phone book basically, or are you gonna have a supplement, or how will it be?
Yeah, no, I'm gonna do a full update. Most of it will be unchanged, obviously, in terms of 600 pages worth. But I'm gonna swap out certain players. I'm gonna reconsider some things that people have argued with me about. I'm gonna include briefly, so it's already a big book, probably just 1 page per chapter on the simulation results. So once I get those will go into the new edition as well. So it'll be, each edition will be only a 5 or 10% change from the previous edition. But I plan on updating this every 3 or 4 years because baseball keeps getting played. And yeah, the bulk of the work's been done. It's just updating. There's already some changes I would make from just last year alone. A few players would finally make it. They just needed one more good year and they can displace somebody. So it's fun.
Sounds like you're talking about Francisco Lindor there.
Yeah, maybe Lindor, maybe Jose Abreu for the White Sox. There's a few names that come. Some of the guys, even though we're not big fans of the Astros right now for ethical reasons, they've had a good run. So there's some players on the Astros like Springer that probably deserve to be on their all-time team at this point. So yeah, that's the plan. I do plan to write more baseball books in the future. And the one thing I've promised myself and everybody is that they won't take 20 years to write. I'm 46 years old and I won't get many books in if they each take 20 years. So I need to crank out books a lot faster than this first one.
Okay, that's right. This one's iconic, Tom. So thanks very much.
Yeah, that made a big splash with the first one, I guess. Yeah. Cool.
Well, again, Tom, on behalf of all of us, both chapters, thank you so much for spending your Saturday morning with us. And I think it was a very enjoyable experience for all of us.
Well, my pleasure. You all have a good rest of your weekend.
Thanks, Tom.
Over and out.
Bye-bye.